Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on TRI reporting. My name is Kara Van Blarkum, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. This presentation will first start with some slides, but from there, we want this to be an interactive session. So if you have any questions or comments, please submit them through the Q&A tab on your screen. If we run out of time, we will answer any unanswered questions via follow-up email. A copy of today's slide deck and additional materials are available in the Handouts tab on your screen. For the best audio quality, be sure to turn your volume up. If you're experiencing any problems, refreshing your screen should help. An on-demand version of the webinar will be available 1 to 2 hours after today's broadcast. You should receive an email notifying you that the recording is available, but it can also be accessed using the same link you received in your email when you registered. And now to introduce our presenters for today's session. Jason Legowski is a senior consultant at Antea Group with over 3 decades of experience in environmental consulting, with specific expertise in the management and remediation of emerging contaminants, particularly PFAS. Mike Polly is Antea Group's water management service line leader and a professional environmental engineer with 25 years of experience in EHS consulting, specifically in EHS regulatory compliance audits and spill control, stormwater, and wastewater management programs. Tony Rossano is a senior manager with more than 45 years of environmental health and safety experience, specifically in Clear Air Act permitting regulations, reporting and compliance, health, safety, and environmental program auditing, and more. And as I mentioned, I'm Kara Van Blarkum. I am Antea Group's Waste and Materials Management Service Line Leader with 20 years of environmental compliance experience, including EPCA reporting, environmental health and safety compliance audits, and more. On our call, we will first go through some of the basics of what TRI reporting is, some key definitions that you should know when doing TRI reporting, a short discussion on PFAS impacts to TRI, and touch on some common findings that we have seen when auditing facilities related to TRI. We will then transition to our question and answer portion of the call. I'll go ahead and kick things off with the basics of TRI reporting. So what is TRI and why are we here today? It's to talk about the Toxic Release Inventory Reporting requirement. This requirement falls under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA. This policy was created in 1986 as a result of chemical emergencies in Bhopal, India, and West Virginia. EPCRA is also responsible for the annual Tier 2 reporting that you may do at the beginning of the year, where you report your maximum amount of chemicals stored on site. While for Tier 2, you essentially report all hazardous chemicals stored on site over the reporting threshold and say, yep, I have this chemical on site, and here's where and how it's stored. TRI is taking it a step further. It's looking at a smaller known set of chemicals, and then if you exceed the reporting thresholds, reporting how much left your property and was released into the environment. These reports are due each year by July 1st for the previous calendar year. So for this year, it's due July 1st, 2025 for reporting year 2024. EPA also makes periodic changes to the chemical list by adding or even removing chemicals. So it's really important to stay up to date on the current chemical list. In order to report under TRI, you have to meet all 3 of the criteria listed here. You must have 10 or more full-time employee equivalents, which is about the equivalent of 20,000 hours per year. In addition, you must have a TRI listed NICS code, or the North American Industry Classification System code. This is a code that you self-identify that basically describes what you do at your facility. In addition, you have to manufacture, process, or otherwise use a TRI listed chemical over the reporting threshold for that reporting year. The industries listed below are all on the TRI NICS covered list. This is a very broad list, and they include a wide variety of subsectors within these sectors listed. For example, manufacturing includes a wide variety of manufacturing industries, including but not limited to food, beverage, textile, wood product, paper, chemical, metal, and transportation, as well as many others. There is also a long list of chemicals that are subject to TRI reporting, and these are just a couple of examples for the ones we typically see being reportable. This includes metal as well as metal compounds, nitric acid, solvents, lead, ethylene glycol from antifreeze, naphthalene or polycyclic aromatic compounds from diesel fuel, as well as your other wastewater treatment chemicals and PFAS. So once you've determined that you need to report, you would also need to figure out how much was released to the environment. So this includes how much went up your stacks through your air emission calculations, went down the drains from your stormwater or wastewater. You can use your stormwater analytical sampling, your wastewater sampling, as well as the total amount of wastewater discharged to help you calculate that. It's also how much was shipped out with your haz waste or scrap metal. So you can use your manifest, your profile sheets to help you characterize that. As well as there's other ways you could have releases. So you would need to report all the different ways the TRI chemical is released into the environment. That includes being treated on-site, off-site, somewhere else, like such as your air control device or any other items that you might have on site where the chemicals could be released into the environment. Little bit about the reporting process. So once you've done your math, you've done your calculations, you figured out, I have to report, I exceed the reporting thresholds for these chemicals, and here's how much got released into the environment. You would then prepare a report, either a Form R or Form A, TRI form, using TryMeWeb on CDX, which is EPA's platform for TRI reporting. The EPA then takes your forms, they'll review them, analyze them, create a report, and they will publish that data for publicly available information. Anyone can access your TRI reporting data, so everything you put on the TRI form becomes public knowledge. So you want to make sure that that information is accurate and true, because the EPA will follow up and reach out to you if there's a dramatic increase or decrease in your releases or change in the chemicals that are being reported each year. For this year, there's some important changes to be aware of. So one, just as a reminder, the reports are due July 1st of this year. The EPA has added 7 new PFAS chemicals, as well as a new category to the TRI chemical list for this year. So it wasn't previously on the TRI list, and it's something to be aware of that if you have that chemical on site, you'll now need to include those for your TRI reports. In addition, PFAS, which Jason will discuss in a little bit more detail, the de minimis concentration for PFAS has been removed. In addition, they've made it a chemical of special concern. So as I mentioned, Jason will discuss those later on when we talk about PFAS in more detail. And now I'll turn it over to Tony Rossano to go over some of the key terms in more detail.
Thanks, Kara. There are several key definitions that are specific to TRI threshold determinations in reporting. For a TRI chemical to be reported, the chemical must be defined as either manufactured, processed, or otherwise used. How the chemical is defined is very important, as reporting thresholds are based on those definitions. For manufactured or processed, the threshold is 25,000 pounds. For otherwise used, the threshold is 10,000 pounds. Manufactured means the TRI chemical is intentionally produced or manufactured for distribution for sale as is or for use in another on-site process. Importing a chemical or ingredient in a chemical into the U.S. also falls under this category. Manufactured also includes producing a TRI chemical coincidentally. For instance, ammonium carbonate is sometimes used as leavening agents in commercial baking, while the bread is rising and hydrous ammonia is manufactured. Another example is the use of nitric acid for pH adjustment in wastewater, which manufactures nitrate compounds. Processing is any chemical where a TRI chemical is incorporated into or causes a change of form or physical state of a TRI chemical. For example, blending, mixing, and repackaging. Processing also includes the distribution into commerce of a TRI chemical. This involves selling the chemical or using it as a component in a product that is then sold. Adding the chemical as part of the product formulation, like adding a solvent such as xylene to a paint mixture, is also processing. In essence, manufacturing is the initial creation of the chemical, while processing involves subsequent steps like distribution or formulation to create a final product, or selling the chemical itself. Otherwise used is a TRI chemical that is not manufactured, processed, or incorporated into any product or chemical. Examples include cleaning agents, solvents such as paints, or using nitric acid for wastewater pH adjustment. Article exemptions includes quantities of listed toxic chemicals that have a specific shape or design, which have in-use functions depending on its shape or design, contained in the article, and does not release a toxic chemical under normal conditions of processing or use. For example, copper wire or copper tubing. The article exemption does not apply to manufacture of an article and/or listed chemicals otherwise used to manufacture the article. An article that releases toxic chemicals under conditions of use or processing, including cutting, grinding, or melting, is still subject to reporting unless total releases from all like items are in a recognizable form, recycled, or releases are less than 0.5 pounds or less. The half-pound limit does not apply to each individual article, but applies to the sum of all amounts released during processing or otherwise used of all like items over the entire reporting year. Most chemicals have de minimis levels. TRI chemicals where the TRI chemical concentration is less than the de minimis values do not have to be counted when determining reporting threshold. The de minimis exemption can apply to chemicals in mixtures or other trade name products processed or otherwise used, chemicals coincidentally manufactured as impurities that remain in products, and chemicals imported in mixtures or other trade name products. The de minimis exemption does not apply to PBTs, which is persistent, bioaccumulative, or toxic chemicals. Manufacturing chemicals in most cases, manufacturing chemicals as byproducts, coincidentally manufacturing chemicals, waste and waste streams from non-exempt sources that are processed or otherwise used, and releases or other waste management activities from mixtures or other trade name products that are not associated with the processing or otherwise used activity. Laboratory exemption applies to toxic chemicals that are manufactured, processed, or used in a laboratory at a facility under the supervision of a qualified technician. These chemicals are not included in determining the threshold amount. However, this does not apply to specialty chemical production laboratories, chemicals manufactured, processed, or used in a pilot scale operation, activities conducted outside of a laboratory. A coal extraction facility is a location where coal is mined either from surface or underground locations. It also includes the processing and preparation of the extracted coal before it is transported to its final destination. Facilities classified under NAICS codes as coal extraction that manufacture, use, or process toxic chemicals in extraction procedures do not have to consider those chemicals in determining if a threshold level has been reached or in calculating the amounts of those chemicals to report. A metal mining overburden exemption refers to the layers of rock, soil, and ecosystem that lie above a coal seam or ore body. It usually covers the valuable mineral deposits that the mining company wants to access. The process of mining involves removing the overburden to reach the desired minerals. Toxic chemicals that are constituents of overburden and are processed or used by overburden metal mining facilities do not have to be included in threshold level calculations or in determination of the amounts of chemicals to be reported. Glycol ethers is a specific category that includes hundreds of chemicals as TRI chemicals. A glycol ether refers to a group of organic compounds characterized by having an ether and glycol structure. It is typically ethylene glycol, diethylene glycol, or triethylene glycol. Glycol ethers based on propylene glycol, dipropylene glycol, or tripropylene glycol are not part of this TRI category. Ethylene glycol is not a glycol ether and is a specific listed TRI chemical. However, 2-butoxyethanol and 2-ethoxyethanol are glycol ethers but are listed as separate TRI chemicals. These two glycol ethers must be reported as individual TRI chemicals. The definition of glycol ethers excludes certain compounds such as surfactant, alcohol ethoxylates, and their derivatives. These are typically non-ionic surfactants used in adhesives, wetting agents, emulsifiers, stabilizers, dispersants, defoamers, cleaners, paints, and coatings. The link on this slide from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality provides a searchable online portal to identify glycol ethers. You can use CS numbers or name searches for these searches. Now I will turn it over to Jason.
Hey, thank you, Tony, for that informative discussion. I want to spend the next couple of minutes talking about PFAS and TRI and how they, I guess, interact. It's a complex topic and it's hard to do it justice within the time allotted for this webinar, but I'll do my best to give you a bit of an overview and hopefully generate a few questions along the way. So I just wanted to take a minute and refresh, I guess, some of the information that was provided earlier, and just mention that a facility is required to report if it meets certain conditions, and those being chemical usage thresholds, whether it may be a covered industry, and based on the number of employees it may have. In those reporting requirements are triggered under US EPA under EPCRA 313. So just kind of refreshing people from what was shared earlier. But the two key points from a requirement perspective, assuming you are a facility that's required to report, is that the reporting threshold for PFAS is currently set at 100 pounds. And in last year, in 2024, US EPA eliminated the de minimis exemption for small quantity producers or users. So that's the information here that's really relevant to note. So I just wanted to take a minute and give you a little bit of, I guess, the backstory related to, I guess, TRI reporting requirements for PFAS. It's really been only 5 years when you start to look back and look at the timeline here. So in 2020, PFAS first became reportable under the Act. And then in the ensuing years, 21, 22, 23, matter of fact, 24 and 25, EPA has continued to add compounds to the list that require reporting. Currently, that list is about 180 compounds. I think it's just under 180, but it's a fairly extensive list and growing every year. The big things here is 2024, as I mentioned on the previous slide, that EPA removed the de minimis limit, and also PFAS was basically listed as a chemical of special concern, or PBT, which stands for persistent bioaccumulative and toxic substance, which basically has a ramification from a reporting requirement, which I'll touch on in a future slide here in a minute. But those were the actions that were taken last year. So really it is the list of reportable compounds under the Act for PFAS continues to grow and is likely to continue to grow. So what does TRI reporting look like for PFAS for the calendar year 2025? Reports are due, obviously, July 1st, 2026 for the 25 calendar year. As I've already mentioned on both previous slides, EPA has continued to add compounds to the list. Currently, there's about 180 compounds thereabouts that are included. Of the 9 that were added in 2024, you should have received supplier notifications of whether those compounds were included in any of the products that they were supplying you as of the first of this year. That's really the 2024 triggering activities. And obviously they would have been reported or be included in reporting for 2025 calendar year, which is due next year. The other thing I really wanted to point out, and it's a whole separate kind of topic, is the whole TSCA PFAS reporting rule, which is a separate reporting requirement under the Act, TSCA, which has a pretty extensive look back period from January 1st, 2011 up to current. And currently, though the dates have been moved a couple of times, and there is some talk under the current administration to delay them again, but there are reporting requirements based on usage and the size of the manufacturer, either in July of this year and or November of this year. We'll see what happens, but it'll be a topic from a separate, I guess, informational webinar, because it's a whole different and extensive topic to look at from a reporting perspective. I just wanted to take, again, a second here and mention that they're under the options for reporting for 2025. Historically, there's 2 forms, Form R and Form A. Form R is the more detailed form. Form A was simple. The issue is Form A cannot be used for chemicals that are basically listed as PBT, so persistent, bioaccumulative, or toxic. So really, as of last year, Form A cannot be used anymore for reporting, for PFAS reporting. So that's really the information that I wanted to convey to you here, is that you're stuck using Form R for PFAS reporting for 2025. Just wanted to give you a quick summary or overview of some of the key points from the last couple of slides related to TRI and PFAS. As mentioned, PFAS have been designated as a persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemical, or PBT. So therefore, Form A is no longer an option as of 2024 as we move forward. So stuck with Form R. With the removal of the de minimis exemption and changes to supplier notifications, you should be receiving more information in safety data sheets to determine if PFAS compounds are present in raw materials that you're receiving or in a product that you're receiving. And the exact amount should be listed on those safety data sheets so that you can properly report them in your calendar year. You should have received that information already as of January 2025 for those compounds to be included in the 25 calendar year reporting. Some things to look forward to potentially. Currently, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the reporting threshold is 100 pounds. There is expectations that that will be reduced potentially to 10 pounds, but we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. And the other, I guess, important thing to note is the definition of PFAS. Whether it's an individual compound or they start to regulate based on class or family. So there have been movements to narrow down that definition, but that has not been finalized yet. So there may be additional changes to the list of the compounds that are included and how they're listed. So it's just something to pay a little attention to as we move through time. So as I wrap up this part of my presentation, I thought I'd leave you with what I consider kind of best practice from a regulatory compliance perspective and give you a few recommendations really around supply chain management, reviewing the data that you have, identifying any data gaps, and whether you fill those with testing of actual products or not, record maintenance, and then just keeping up to date on PFAS regulations, which really is a bit of a moving goalpost at the moment. So there are challenges there, but there are entities out there, including us, that can help support you on that. So this is what I consider kind of best practice. And with that, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Mike, who's going to talk about some common findings during audits. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to talk briefly about some common environmental compliance findings related to TRI that we see within our environmental audit practice. We bring these up specifically because they represent a theme of the kind of compliance gaps we see most often with our clients that trigger TRI regulations. This first finding is our most common one in that the facility has simply never determined whether or not TRI rules apply to them. Their business is in a covered industry NAICS code. They have more than 10 employees and they use one or more of the EPGRA Section 313 chemicals, but they just have not evaluated the quantity of chemicals or materials that are manufactured, processed, or otherwise used. Again, going back to our earlier who is subject to the TRI rule slide, they just haven't done the evaluation. If the evaluation is done and your operations are below the TRI threshold, then great. You don't need to report for that reporting year. But if your operations change, like you bring on new processes, chemicals, or materials, you should be updating that evaluation to make sure that you don't trigger that threshold in future years. The next finding is from a known TRI reporter, but they missed something when doing their evaluation. In this example, we have fugitive emissions from lead soldering of electrical components. Sometimes operations like soldering may get overlooked, but at a high enough frequency and volume, an electrical component manufacturer may use more than 100 pounds of lead by percentage in that leaded solder in a year, which could trigger inclusion in a TRI report. In this case, even wipes used for soldering cleanup would need to be considered in that calculation. In this third finding, a food manufacturing facility was using nitric acid in their CIP process that was ultimately sent to their wastewater pretreatment system. The nitric acid interacted with a wastewater pH adjustment chemical and inadvertently created nitrate compounds in their wastewater effluent. This was a new facility that this client had recently acquired operation of, and they had just not considered this secondary production of nitrate as a possibility of where to look for TRI chemicals. And finally, in this last example, a copper wire manufacturer was changing the diameter of a raw wire spool to be made into their product. They didn't realize that this processing created more than a half pound of copper dust and other off-spec cuts that negated the article exemption and therefore needed to be included in their TRI report.
Great. Thank you, Tony, Jason, and Mike for sharing your expertise and insights on this topic. Now we will take questions from the audience. Remember, you can still submit your questions via the Q&A tab up until the close of our broadcast today. All right, thank you, everyone. All right, and so now we've entered into our Q&A portion. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to put them into our chat and we'd be happy to answer those. And I do see that we've already gotten some. So I will go ahead and share the first question. So we recently learned that we trigger TRI reporting requirements. We will report for this year, but do we need to do anything for the several years where we didn't submit reports? And the answer is yes. You would need to go back and look. With TRI, they look at the last 5 years. So you would want to look back at the last 5 years of your purchases, your usage, your release calculations, and determine if you should have reported for those last 5 years. And you'd then want to go ahead and submit those. It's a lot better if you're the one that identified that you should have been doing back reporting rather than if you report and then the EPA determines that you should have been back reporting. So it's usually better to just go ahead and do that evaluation if you've determined that you should have been reporting. Okay, the next question. Tony, do you want to take an answer at this? Is a chemical's TRI applicability identified on the safety data sheet?
Yes, it is. With the new safety data sheet requirements, especially the supplier notifications, if you look at section 15 of your safety data sheets, if there's any TRI chemicals, they should be listed on that. It doesn't mean that if they're not listed, they don't have them. Your supplier may not have updated their safety data sheet yet. So I would look at section 15 first and then look at section 3 for the ingredients and then see if anything stands out or just check the CES numbers to see if they're on the TRI list.
All right, thank you. All right, is there a template or checklist that already exists to help conduct an evaluation? I would say there probably isn't a template. Really what it is you want to look at what products you have on site because that can vary from site to site. So you want to look at your particular products, look at your composition, of those ingredients and then do the math and figure out if you've used more than the reporting threshold for any TRI components that are on your safety data sheets. And then once you do that, then you'd want to look at your releases. So like if you have any air emissions, stormwater sampling results that you've taken for that particular component, wastewater, your waste or anything else from that regard. Once you determine you need to report. If you don't have to report, then you don't need to worry about the release calculations. It's really that first initial threshold evaluation that you want to look at. Okay, and then how do I go about figuring out what my NICS code is and if it's on the TRI list? So for that, you could look to see if you have your NICS code, it should be listed on your OSHA 300 log. You can also check to see if you've previously reported that NICS code to the EPA through ECHO, the Enforcement Compliance Online portal. And then you'd want to look at the specific list that's available on the TRI website within the EPA. They have a list of all of the NICS codes that apply. If you know only the SIC code, your standard industrial classification, rather than your NICS code, there is a crosswalk that you can pull up online and look at how the SIC code compares to that NICS code to find the relevant NICS code that correlates with that SIC code in your process. If you still don't know what your NICS code is, then you'd want to look and try to find like keywords on the NICS database for what you manufacture, process at your facility. And you can use that to identify what that NICS code is and then look at the list for that. Jason, there's a question related to PFAS here. So if my safety data sheets don't say anything about PFAS, do I need to look further to determine if we have any?
I thought I was going to get out of this easy. Short answer to the question is yes. Just because your SDS doesn't specifically call out PFAS, there is a good likelihood that it could potentially still be there. And ways, I guess, of checking is looking a little bit deeper into the potentially marketing material from the manufacturer. There are digital screening tools that are out there where you can put cast numbers in or chemical name and will help identify whether something might be classed as a PFAS or not, even though it may not specifically be called out on an SDS. So there's lots of times information isn't included in the SDS and it might be kind of hidden under the trade secrets clause or maybe have a name that doesn't jump out as being a PFAS. But there are tools out there to help you look and determine whether it's actually PFAS containing or not.
All right, thank you. Okay, the next one is, does any state have different TRI reporting requirements? So most states actually do follow the federal reporting thresholds and all use the same reporting platform, which is the TriMeWeb on CDX. The only state I can really think of that has its own separate kind of system, in addition to the TRI, so you still have to do the federal, is Massachusetts with I think it's called the Toxic Use Reduction Act, which has its own forms that you have to submit. I think it's just an additional form that you would also submit for Massachusetts. But I think that's the only state that really has its own TRI program. Okay, so Tony, if I realize I made a mistake on a previously submitted report, am I able to go back in and revise it?
Yes, you are. Like Kara said, if you can go back up to 5 years, and if you see you did make a mistake, just access your Try Me on CDX, pull up your old report, and you do a correction, and you actually mark it as a correction. So then it goes in. There's no penalty for updating your forms or anything like that. So I would suggest definitely, if you see you made a mistake, go back and correct it as soon as possible.
All right, thank you. All right, and then if my facility is moving to another location this year, how do we handle reporting TRI? So when that happens, you still need to report if you exceed the reporting thresholds. You'd want to look though at each individual location. So if you move partway through the year, you'd look at your production in that first part at that first location, if you exceed the reporting thresholds, and then you'd look at the second location to determine if you exceed the second half of the year. And then the same is true if you close the facility, you still need to look at your evaluation as well. Even if the facility has closed, you may still need to report a year later for any production that was done during the year that you guys closed. All right. And then I see one more. If I exceed the reporting thresholds but have no releases, do I still need a report? The short answer is yes. If you exceed the reporting thresholds and you have more than 10 employees and you have that NICS code, you would still need to report. You just, if depending on the chemical, you may be able to use that Form A instead of the Form R, which basically just says, yeah, we have that chemical, we used it over the reporting threshold, but our releases were really small. And that's basically all you have to report on the Form A. It's nice and simple, as Jason mentioned. The Form R is the more detailed form where you would have to then spell out all the releases for those PBT chemicals, or if you used more than 1 million pounds of it, you would have to use that Form R, regardless of if the releases were minimal. If it's, I think, less than 500 pounds of releases, I think that's when you can use the Form A, as long as it's manufactured process, otherwise use less than 1 million pounds. And it's not a PBT, that special chemical of concern. Okay, and I think that was the last question, unless anyone else wants to throw a question in the chat. But I guess that's everything. Hopefully we answered everybody's questions. If there's anything you want to know further, feel free to drop it in the chat real quick. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to us. Our information is on this in the PowerPoint. Feel free to reach out directly if you have any additional questions or need any support. But thank you again, Tony, Jason, Mike, for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. Don't forget, you can download a copy of today's slides and additional materials from the handouts tab on the screen. Today's session will be available within about 2 hours, and you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording. There's also a survey that will pop up after we close the webinar broadcast, and we'd like to ask that you complete that short survey and give us feedback so that we might better serve your needs going forward. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.